Habakkuk chapter 3. No, it's Rich. It's Rich Novak. Keep Rich Novak in your prayer. He will be having surgery in 2 days. So, open heart. Yeah.
Yeah, today something didn't go right, so now he has open heart.
Roberta, I need your new email address. That reminds me, because you're not getting them. That's why. Yeah. Rich had, they tried to put stents in today, and the artery, whatever that thing is, they found out he needs open heart surgery, so they're waiting 2 days to do open heart surgery. So, I don't know. His wife didn't tell me the end of this. That's what? Oh, of course. Of course, you ain't going in my neck unless you're a vampire. Pardon me? Yeah, prevention is... So, anyway, Habakkuk chapter 3. Let's see how far the Lord leads us through this today. So this is a wonderful thing, and as we see... You know, one of the things I try and do when we're teaching the Bible, I try and do things... I want to know what the writer is going through, why he's responding the way he does. And sometimes it doesn't always work. But as I look at Habakkuk, and remember, he's looking for certainty in a time that's very uncertain. I think we could say the same thing, right? So, but his response becomes a vertical response instead of what we always have as horizontal responses, because we look at things around us. So let's open in prayer, and we'll begin class. Father God, we thank you for this time. Again, the ability to come together, to sharpen each other, to hear from you, to hear from, in this case, your prophet Habakkuk. We thank you for this time. We thank you for listening ears, attentive ears, wanting hearts to hear from you. And Father, that's what we want to. We want to hear from you today. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to try and go through, my goal is to get through the chapter, but you know how that usually works. But if we don't, we won't be able to finish it till next year. I like saying that. It's always like, what? So we're not meeting next week, and we're not meeting the week after. But the week after is on Thursday night. We're going to have something for Thursday night. We're going to have on the New Year's Eve. I always get this. We're going to play some games. We're going to take communion together. We're going to have some dessert, spend time together. So mark your calendar. So instead of Wednesday night of that last week, it's Thursday night, 7 o'clock, I think I scheduled for. So, also, Saturday night, Lizzie told me to remind everybody, is our Christmas party. If you haven't heard about it or don't know about it, don't ask me about it. I'm attending. Yes.
Sandwiches, soups, and sweets. So you can either bring sandwiches and sweets, or you can bring soup and sweets. And we're bringing a Secret Santa gift that we're going to exchange with $10 to $15 gifts. Wrap it. If it's gender specific, mark it on the package. Otherwise, if it's a neutral, just bring it, and we're going to play a little Santa exchange game.
6:30, right?
6:30.
It's at 6:30, yes.
That's at 6:30. New Year's Eve's at 7. So I want everybody to hear as close as we can leave to New Year's Eve over. But where we used to live, it was gunshots, so we had to be home at a certain time. So yeah, not as bad as where I lived. It was fireworks where you live. This was gunshots where we live. So we were home before the AK-47s went off in the M16. So that's when you knew you were safe, when you were at home. It was bad. And the day after I go out on we had a aluminum closed-in patio, and you see bullet holes. Seriously, I said, gum in that one, gum in that one. That's it. That's what it is. And it's coming down in my neighborhood, and they don't live that close. All right, Habakkuk chapter 3. As you can see, as we go to verse 1, and it is a response. We've seen in Habakkuk 1 through 4, and Habakkuk 1:12 through 2:1, Habakkuk asks very bold questions of God. And God answers both those questions and responds. What we should always do, we're going to Bible study now. We're going to study the Bible. The purpose of Bible study is to gain God's viewpoint on things. So Habakkuk was doing the same thing. He wanted God's viewpoint on the things that he saw. Because the things we usually see, we filter through a human standpoint, a human way we look at things and say, okay, this is how this makes sense. I have an enemy, he's a nasty guy, he's wicked, God should kill him. And this guy stays around forever, and he outlives everybody, and he's a blatant pain to everybody. And you say, God, what's the deal? And God says, I have a better plan. You say, God, that doesn't work with me. My viewpoint is this guy should be extinguished. And God says, well, I have my timing. And in this case, what's happening is God has warned Habakkuk that the southern kingdom was going to be taken out by Babylon or the Chaldeans, the same group of people. And they were not a good group of people. We've talked about that. And God says, how can you do this to such a righteous people? It's always interesting to look at other people and say, man, that guy sins so much, I must be righteous. Isn't that a great way to look at things? You will find somebody that's really just a blatant evil person, and you say, man, and I gotta be, man, I'm the most righteous guy I know, because I know that guy. So that's kind of what Habakkuk's doing. He's looking at what's gone on in the evils in the world, which are pretty bad, and he's looking at his people and says, we're just people. But they were just as evil because they had the oracles of God, they had God, the prophets of God, and they just didn't. We know when Jesus came, we know the one thing that stands out is they rejected their Messiah. I mean, how much more blatant can you get? And so that's where we're at. We're dealing with a guy that has a viewpoint that first of all, he is righteous. He is. We know that because God's not going to talk to him if he's not. God's speaking with him. He's a prophet. But, however, he's judging the whole community through his eyes. And if we've seen this prior, Israel's already gone into idolatry. The priesthood has been very watered down. If anything, they're not leading people. They're not feeding people. We hear how people have responded, and we know from the New Testament the prophets were basically scorned and put to death. So how did people react to somebody giving you the Word of God? I say, I pray that my congregation doesn't hate me today so that I'll walk in, they want to kill me. And that's kind of what the prophets were doing. They would give the word out, but they were kind of like, is this guy going to kill me? So the first thing we see here is, though, it's a prayer of Habakkuk, verse 1, according to the Shin Gayon, or Shingayoth here it says. It's interesting, the Greek Old Testament says this is an ode. Let me tell you kind of what this thing is. It's really neat. This is a musical theme through this whole thing. And I tried to say, I'm going to set this to music. My musical abilities are, forget it. I'm not going to be able to do it. But I looked at this and I said, as we looked at this, what the Shingayon does, it sets a musical theme, musical tempo, a rhythm. I mean, I don't know. These are all involved in that. I'm going to say something, and I don't want you to think this is some jungle mantra going up or something, but it was a passionately wild song with a rapid changes in rhythm, but it doesn't mean it was wild. You understand? It was just, I looked at it like this. It's a wonderful score. I tried to think of somebody, maybe not a Wagner, but because I don't think it was operatic, or Beethoven, but it was a score. And in these short verses, think of it like that, because here's what's involved in this. If you look at chapter 3, verse 3, real quick, we'll go back to it. In the middle of the verse, you see the word Shelah, or Shelah. It could be pronounced either way. And then it's the same thing in verse 13, the same word. And in verse 9 and verse 13, all three. This has to do with music too, and we'll talk about it a little bit too. It's got a musical kind of tenor behind it, if it is. It's got a kind of a duality. We'll talk about it when we get to it. But look at the last verse. At the last verse, verse 19, it says, for the choir director on my stringed instrument. So we know from verse 1 to verse 19, this is some kind of musical score. And I want you to get that, because when somebody writes music, there's a lot of other things involved in it. If a writer writes a story, there's other things involved. We know the story of how we got our national anthem. The bombs bursting in air and all those things. And he's writing, Francis Scott Key's writing this stuff down, because he's emotionally involved. He's incarcerated. We're writing is sometimes, okay, I got 6 lines, I'm going to get a drink, kind of thing. Music has a lot more involvement to it. So if anything, I don't know what his job was. Nowhere in the book does it say Habakkuk was that. So I'm going to say he was a musician of some sort. So I don't know, since it says here, he on my stringed instruments. I have a friend, most of you have seen him, Joseph. He knows how to play a lot of stringed instruments. So sometimes you get a guy that's good with stringed instruments. They can play a variety of different instruments. So it had a variety to it. Well, let me not leave you hanging. Let's kind of just talk about this word so you can kind of get the musical feel for it, because we're going to run through it. And I can't put music to it, which is interesting. Did you ever think it's interesting that God didn't see fit to say, here's the Psalms. What's the Psalms? We know that as the Bible's hymn book, right? Not one of them has any musical score to it. And we know they're music because a lot of them were said, to the musician and to the... we know this is musical, this last part, but we don't have the music to go with it. But we have the words. So what's more important when you listen to music that has that kind of theological drive? It's the words, right? You could set any kind of music. And I kind of think God likes variety. So, for instance, in my case, one of my good friends is Will. You guys know him. He likes Christian rap. I'm going, really? And I like jazz. So how do we get together musically? We have never done anything musically together. Never. We've gone to games, we've played golf together, families have been melded together a lot in different occasions, but we have never done anything with music together. Our tastes vary. But we can say, can this be set to rap? Could this be Habakkuk's rap? It could have been. I don't think it was, because that's not music. I hope he gets this. Could it be set to jazz? Well, not a lot of jazz I have doesn't have verbiage in it, but there's jazz singers. Some of the great ones have been jazz singers. Could it have been jazz? Could have been. But think of this. With the varieties of tastes in the room, how many different musical scores could we come up with the music part with the same words? So the theology should still be there, but the ability to remember it. And I know kids love nursery rhymes that are sung, right? And they can remember them. It helps for memory. I don't think any of you have gone back to your nursery rhymes and said, okay, I'm going to change the words, and I'm going to put chapter 7 of Matthew to the nursery rhyme so I can remember how to memorize it. We just don't do that, but it is a good tool. So, with this word Shelah, let me just tell you something about it. It's a Hebrew word. It's hard to find out what it means. If you go to a Hebrew dictionary, it'll say lift up or exalt. But that's not what the word does within the musical context. Even some dictionaries will say meaning uncertain. How do you have a meaning uncertain?
Talking about the word Shelah in verse 1?
No, I'm talking about the words now that are in verse 3, verse 9, and verse 13. Shelah. Selah or Shelah. Or if you want to get really fun, you can say Shelah. Because these are all word variations to the same thing. Okay, this word itself not being interpreted, we got to understand how it fits into the context. We got a musical understanding in the first verse, and a last one in 19, and one in verse 19. Here's the 5 possibilities, and I think they all have an ability to grasp this, because I want you to get the flow of the music. Because what happens is, if you notice in verse 3, where does that word fall? It falls in the middle of the verse, right? It's an awkward place for it. Why wouldn't they just finish the verse right there? Because if you were to here's a really good thing. You try and outline things. A good way to outline things is find something that's repeated, either at the start or something at the end. Well, this word's repeated in verse 3, verse 9, and verse 13. Don't you think it's a good place to break and say that's how we outline this chapter? And it works out pretty good. You'll see it. It works good. In verse 9, if you notice, in my version, I pray yours is the same. The verse that has it in there is in the middle of the verse again. You see that? I said, why did they do that? In verse 13, it's at the end of the verse. Good, I like that. Okay? But let's say, what are we going to do with that word? So what are we going to do with that word? Because if we read it, it sounds awkward, because where did they do with it? They didn't put it in the sentence, they put it where? Way off to the side. You ever read music, and at the top of the music, there's different symbols like codas and rest mark, all these things that are all around music that has different marks. So what are those marks there for? Well, most of them, I have no clue. I don't know music that well, but I can look at it and say, okay, that's there for a reason. There's a repeat here, which is within the music. I got to do what? I got to go repeat that whole stanza again. So what is this here for? And if you notice, it's off to the side, which is kind of neat. Here's the possibilities. First of all, I would say this more than anything. It's some kind of musical notation. Okay? We got to figure out how it falls in, and we'll kind of do this. And I think all of these, believe it or not, here's what I do with definitions when a word's kind of you can't nail it down. It's like I call them jello words. You know, what do you do with it? You try and nail it down, it keeps moving. You put them all in. Put them all in and see if they work within the context. The next definition would have, it's a pause, like a musical pause, but the pause is for silence or reflection. You just don't pause and say, okay, next. Because if any of you are familiar with music, when you got a rest or a pause, and then you wait a beat for somebody else to hit a drum or something, and you start again with your part of the music. That's not what this means. It means when we pause, we're going to sit there and go, okay, we hit that word. Let's think about what was just said. So we stop. So I think if anything, I kind of say, stop for a second. What are we going to do with that stop? Okay, here's another idea, and here's another thing that somebody put in. When this word was put in, it's a signal for worshipers to fall prostrate on the ground. I have issues with that. I have issues with that because if somebody was singing that song and that word came up, and I would just, out of my car, just drop out of the car while it's moving and hit no. There's time and place for reflection. It's a word that means forever. It's a word that can mean forever, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't have that sense to it because there's a pure word that they could have used to put in there. We do that in our songs. You ever notice some of our songs? At a song, there'll be an amen in it. And you go, well, why is the amen in there? Because I think that has that feeling to it, but that's not the meaning to this word. I think, again, why would they use this word when there's a perfectly good word to use for that? That's what I'm saying. I look at it like this. I think it's a time for a dramatic pause within the context of what's going on, for you to reflect, for you to think, for you to do the same thing Habakkuk's doing. Have you genuinely absorbed the material that Habakkuk seems to now flow from his heart? He's given it, and I think sometimes we're far from it. You know, we have 3 chapters and we say, wow, what a concise conversation Habakkuk had with God. And I think sometimes we got to realize this was pulled out for us to study. I don't believe this is the whole thing and Habakkuk and God were done ever having a discussion again. But Habakkuk had to go from a human viewpoint of life to a divine viewpoint. How do we do that? How many steps does it take to say, I'm just looking and everything's coming in at me and it's all about me and us and woe. And now all of a sudden, he's at the end of the book, he's saying, all I can do is just worship you. How did it take him? We say, if we were to write down, here's the 3 steps or the 7-step program to go from a human viewpoint and self-absorbed to this viewpoint. And we say, let's go to Habakkuk. He did it. I don't think you'd get it from just that. So what's helping us is we say, here's a part of what Habakkuk's saying in verses 2 and 3. Let's think about it. Okay, then we go to the second part of verse 3 all the way down to the first part of verse 9. Think about this now. Take some time. Reflect on it. Chew the words. Think about what Habakkuk, make it part of you. Some people will look outside. Today was really nice. So you look outside and what a glorious day. And we just like this. But we think how much it took that's a part of who God is. It's His creation. Have we reflected on that? Have we thought about that? Because here's my, I was taught this a long time ago and I'm going to keep it because it works really well. When we got verse breaks, remember the original manuscripts didn't have verse breaks. They didn't have chapter breaks. You got the book of Habakkuk in a scroll that contained the 12. They contained more than just that one book. Okay, so I'm thinking the guy that came up with this was riding a horse and he hit a ditch and he said, that's a good chapter break. And then he hits a little pothole like you do in Tulsa and he, verse. I'm sorry, notes on...
As a musician, I'm having to wonder if it's not
The,
When you look at a sheet of music, a lot of times in the right-hand corner or
right.
throughout the music, just above the music, you'll have rapido or adagio.
Right.
One of those words.
I am familiar with those, though.
I'm trying to tell you how the music is supposed to be played. And I'm wondering if it's...
The only problem I'm having with that, though, and it's an idea, we're not playing the music. We're reading the script of it. So it.
Even as you're reading, though, if you're imagining in your mind kind of how it would have gone, it gives you the feeling.
Like a crescendo, and then yeah,
Splendor covers the heavens.
yeah. And I will go with that too. I mean, we could, like I said, I think the very first definition, I said some kind of musical notation. But I'm looking at it again, since I get to teach this. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I'm thinking this is what he did to get where he got. He thought about something. He reflected on it. So when we say, let's say for instance, we say it is a musical pause, a rest. What do you do with the rest? Okay, we pick back up, but I don't think he wants us to do that. I think what's being reflected here is he wants us to think about the material before us. Most of us have been in classes at some point, whether we elementary, middle school, whatever, and we regurgitate information to do what? To pass the test, to get out of that class.
Master the contents that you can be successful in later years.
Thank you, 5th grade teacher, but that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. I remember, listen, I'm going to be, this is brutally honest time. This is the hard part. I went to a Christian school, and what was required every week was we memorize a verse every week. Listen to this. Every week we memorize a verse. For 6 years I'm memorizing verses. And how many verses did I retain? Oh, about 7. I don't know. But that week was up. Listen, I had 8th grade teacher. She says, you got to memorize 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, and we're all walking through the halls and we're singing, love is patient, love is kind, love is, to each other, because we can't remember this thing because we are not patient. We're not kind about this. We're annoyed. How much was it getting in? Because we were memorizing it for a test. We weren't absorbing it for life. You understand the difference? And I think sometimes we can say, I know the Bible says this somewhere, and we're like fiddle on the roof, the good book must say this. And he said, wait a second, that's not even in the Bible. But it must say it, because why? Because it's my viewpoint. It's got to be there. So I think what he's trying to do is get us to think it through, to absorb it. And I think the more we think something through, and we got to fight with it and struggle with the thoughts, it becomes part of us. Hold your finger here. Go to Psalm chapter 7. Psalm 7. Let's try and do something a little different, because our mind is thinking, we're in Psalms, we're in the hymn book of the Bible, we're going to think different. So let's kind of look at Psalm 7 for a second. What do you have the same thing I did? Yeah, isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing? God does similar things in different places. But as we look at this, as we read through it, we'll just begin in verse 1. We're just going to kind of give some highlights here. Psalm 7 it says, "O Lord my God, in Thee," and that even sounds like it's starting off a song, doesn't it? We're so used to singing that. "In Thee I have taken refuge. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there is none to deliver." So far he's talking about what? Himself, right? Okay. Then he says, "O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is injustice in my hands, if I have rewarded evil to my friend or plundered him who without cause was my adversary, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life down to the ground and lay my glory in the dust." And then we have that, well, it does say here, which is interesting in my study Bible, it says crescendo, musical interlude, or pause. Those are all different, aren't they? as I look at music, those are different parts of music. A pause is different than a crescendo, okay? Even though a crescendo and stop would be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Whoa, what just happened? Where's the rest of this? Right?
And then verse 6 is about the Lord.
That's right. So we got to pause. We're thinking about this person writing this. In this case, it's really easy. Look what it says at the very beginning of this. It says a Shin Gaioth of David. So this is the same idea right here. Okay, and he's doing that. So David's talking about, obviously, David. Now he's going to do what? Now he's going to reflect on, he says, now you think about what I said. Can you really think about what I was going through? Can you understand what was happening with me? And it even says in that little writing above verse 1, it says, which he sang to the Lord. So I don't know about you, we always hear about David playing before Saul, but David must have had a pretty good voice, or we don't know. I sang, nobody really knows. Because I don't like doing it in public, but I can sing. I tried out for Fiddler on the Roof when I was in high school. And the first thing the kid asked me is, are you trying out for the rabbi? I go, heck no, I want the big job. I know the songs. Because I know if I were a rich man, I'd beat-a-lead-a-lead all day long. Okay? So David was singing this, but notice what it says in verse 6. I think it's important. Because all of a sudden he changes the whole feeling of what's going on. Basically, he says, stand up. I know it says arise, but stand up, O Lord, in thine anger. And he's actually commanding God to stand up in anger. Let it rip, God. Lift up, another command, lift up thyself against the rage of my adversaries and arouse thyself for me. Now, we've got to understand, David's just not saying, I got enemies and I'll like them, God tear them down. David is the king of Israel. He's got enemies. That means the enemies of David are against Israel. The enemies of Israel, the enemies of God. So he's not asking him something that's not theologically sound. His timing's wrong. But he's not, he wants his timing. Rouse thyself for me. Thou hast appointed judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples encompass me, and over them return thou to a high place. The Lord judges the people. So what does he understand about God? God's not only able to do these things, God has a wrath, God has an ability to avenge enemies, but He's also the judge. So He's going to do it what? When He avenges them, He's going to do it justly, not just for vengeance sake. You get what I'm saying? Vindicate me, O Lord. So, or in other words, judge me, Lord. Judge me. And I think the reason the translators put in vindicate, because find me just. Find me just. Because he says, O Lord, according to my righteousness and my integrity that is within me. In other words, what's my heart's intent? Am I doing this just because I'm hateful, wicked, or am I doing this because your name needs to be honored? Why am I wanting my enemies to be destroyed? And as we see this whole thing, I don't want to go through all of Psalm 7, but you can get the idea. David singing this to the Lord, and it's almost heartfelt, if anything. And I think that's what we got to look at. Because some of our music today has got some heartfelt in it, I guess, or stirring in this. But when you look at the words, you say, what does that words mean? Here's what you really need to do. Go find some of the top 10 Christian songs and read the words. You go, what? What? It's really hard to write a song that has 5 words and you repeat it 18 times. Okay, we got it. I'm not trying to belittle it, but not too many of our songs are theological. They're just emoting and emotional sometimes. And here we have a song that's in our Bible that's there's emotions there, but it's very theological. So go back to Habakkuk chapter 3, and I would say this, just for conversation's sake, since this is Habakkuk's, I'm going to call it his ode, because I like that word the Septuagint used, his ode to God. He wants the words to be music to your ears. I don't know if that can always happen. I know some people like poetry and that's just music. If somebody just reads that's I like when somebody really good can read. There's at Chet's old church, before Chet passed away, there's a guy named Corey that used to read the Bible to people. And he used to be in some daytime soap opera for a while. And when he read scripture, he'd go, oh, is that what it says? It was all of a sudden, it was like, wow, I can grasp that. And sometimes you get books on tape and some of these guys can really feel the force of it. But I want these words to be music to our ears as we do this, because what this prayer is made up of is not only requests, but it's also made up of understanding of who God is. So verse 2, Lord, I have heard the report of thee, and I fear. O Lord, hang on, I didn't know that was in my pocket. I don't want that to ring. That would be very embarrassing, especially if it was my mom calling me. I didn't call her today. Let's do it again. Verse 2. Lord, I have heard the report about thee, and I fear. It's interesting because he's heard a report. He's taken in information. The word's used a couple times. Isaiah uses, who has heard our report, God? So just think of it, Lord, I've heard your message. I've heard what you've said to me. I've grasped your statements. Then he says, O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years, and in the midst of the years make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So here's the three requests he does right here in verse 2. He says, revive thy work. Revive thy work. It's interesting because sometimes we don't get the intensity. Now, this is the opening score of this, whatever this musical score is. And he's basically saying, here's a command, Lord, revive this, and it's intensive. It's an intensive stem in the Hebrew. So he's saying intensely, bring it to life. Bring it to, what?
Mine says preserve alive.
Yeah, but I think what he wants to do is give it to life. Remember, he's reviving it. It was once alive, no longer alive. He wants to bring, so give it life. Call it to life. What is he calling to life? What he's asking God to do is, God, you've got plans. You got a design for what's going on. Bring life to it. Breathe life into it. Carry it out. Carry out your plan. And I want you to understand, in this song, what it comes across is Habakkuk's pleading with God as he's commanded. You can't command God, can you? But it comes across as a command because he's pleading with God. What he's saying is, make alive what you've predicted. Bring to life what you've predicted. And I like that. You said you'd do it, so do it. Isn't that right? Didn't God say, I would do such and such to these people? And in the Babylonians' case, he's going to destroy, God's going to destroy Babylon. And all Habakkuk's saying is, Lord, you said it. I believe you said it. I believe you can do it. Do it! What's his problem? His problem is time. His problem is time. So he says, so the next thing he looks at in this prayer, he says, in the midst of years. Now, that's kind of a real wishy-washy statement. In the midst of what years? And what's he talking about? I think what happens is our translations don't always capture it. What it's basically saying is, anytime now. That's the vernacular we'd use. Lord, do it now. And when now? Anytime now would be fine. Like, what did we used to say? Isn't that somebody used to say, anytime now would be good, yesterday would have been what? Even better? So that's the kind of feel behind it. But there's also one in front of it because he knows there's a historical process that God's involved in. So he says, anytime now. So right now would be best. Yesterday would have been better. But if you do it tomorrow, I know you're God and you'll get it done. So he's basically saying, at this moment, in this land, make it known, your work. Notice what he says, in the midst of years, make it known. How does he make it known? Everybody knows it, that it was God. You know what's interesting? When we look at the end times, when God does what he does in the end times, it's not going to be a question, oh, did God do this? Oh, could it have been some natural catastrophe? Could it be just the way things are? No, God will do it. And if we tie this in a lot, and we'll see as we go through some of this, with Revelation 19, you're going to see, wow. I think he's talking about the end, the final parts of the, because I think he's talking about the final return of the Lord. Here's the interesting thing. We can't, I don't want to say this is this. I was taught something. My eschatology is different than most people. my understanding of in things, it'll all work out at the end. So I'm a kind of a pantheologist. It'll all work out. I do think there's a certain plan how things will get carried out. And I think there's an unveiling of who Christ was as he returns. I do believe there's a tribulation, but how everything happens and at what point, we can sit here all day and say, isn't he going to do this in this period? He's going to do this. And it will happen at this period. It's not going to happen today. Christ isn't going to return in his full glory with Lord of Lords and King of Kings written on his thigh. That's not happening now. But when he does do it, he will do it. And everyone will what? Know it. And every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. So all those things are going to happen. The problem is, where are we going to be and when are we going to be? And when I'm going to see it from what vantage point? I don't know. But I'm game for it, Yeah, I'm going to be, yes, I understand it. But when you say with the Lord, what does that mean? I do understand that, but am I going to be like behind him? Am I going to be, what vantage point do I have? Yeah, that's it. That's and as we see this unfold, I think most of this, to answer your question, I think most of what Habakkuk's looking at is, and this is hard because this is written in past tense. That's what I got to explain to you. When it's written in past tense, you think it's already happened in Habakkuk's time. It can't happen in Habakkuk's time because it hasn't happened. He's asking the Lord to bring it forth. So it hasn't happened. And it won't happen in his time because certain things has to happen. So you say, is it in the Babylonian period when the Babylonians are destroyed after the 70-year captivity? Yes, but no, because not the same things happen. You got to read the verbiage. When this happens, the whole world will know. The seas will know. The whole entire heavens will shake. That didn't happen in any period of time we've had yet. So we got to say, what's he talking about? So he's talking about this will happen at this time, but it's nothing like what will happen at that time. So what we have here, so I can explain it to you, it's a past tense, but it's called a future perfect. In other words, in the future, this will happen, but how does God talk? He talks as a done deal. So this is very hard for us to grasp sometimes when he's talking in these superlatives that say, wow, it seems like it's done. So as we're looking at it, we're kind of feeling like that's a past event. But when you look at what he's talking about, it hasn't happened yet. You kind of get what I'm saying? I know I don't want to be confusing, but the language is very clear. It's got to happen like this, or it hasn't happened, or God's a liar, and let's go whatever we got to do other than this kind of thing. And I think that's kind of neat because what it does, it makes it very alive for Habakkuk at his time, and it makes believers always want to look forward to what God will bring forth. So I think too many of us are too present oriented or too past locked in. In other words, God, you've done this in the past, but you're not doing anything now. So you're locked into the past because God's done something. And God says, no, that was just a picture of what I will do. I can do so much more. When we talk about the Egyptians and the Red Sea and Israel passing through that was a little vignette of what God will do to the whole earth. Just think about that for a minute. Just a little. So God's saying, if I could do that there, I can do so much more. It's going to happen, but it's a done deal. In the Greek, it would be a future indicative. A future indicative says, here's something that's going to happen in the future, but it's done. How do you talk like that? Only God can do that. So God can also talk as a past tense, as it's a done deal, but it won't happen to the future. Are you confused enough? Yeah, I hope so. We'll get through this, and you'll see as we look at some of these items, and we'll say, has that happened yet? And we'll say, no, but God's talking like it's done, right? So, the third thing he has here, that as far as as we looked at this idea, we also have to remember God is sovereign. And as a sovereign God, he will do certain things within the historical process that involves the whole world, but it's his historical process he's carrying out. It's not how the world's history fall. I know there's a class called World History, another one called U.S. History, another one called that. We don't take a class called God Unveiling History. And that's what he's been doing all this time. There's not a time that God doesn't... Here, just for sake of conversation, go to Romans 13 for a second. After last night's debate, I'm nervous and nuts and crazy. I did not watch it. The vignette I got was enough. We got chaos. And chaos is only for Get Smart, if you remember Get Smart. That's all it's good for. Romans 13. Look at verse 1. And I want us to get a picture of this as we go back to Habakkuk. It says, let every person in subjection to the government authorities. Let every person be in subjection to the government authorities. Who's he talking to? Everybody. So that doesn't mean, I always tell Lizzie what drives me crazy about some movies that are talking about the whole world. There's just Americans in the movie. Wait a second, the whole world doesn't have just Americans, so automatically the movie kind of like, I shut it out. There's no Japanese, there's no, what's going on? It's the whole world and it's just Americans and all the people from the South or something, But this is talking about everybody, so it's every government. And it says, for every government, let person be in subjection to that government, but there is no, because listen what he says. He gives you a reason, Paul gives you a reason why to be subjection. For there is no authority except from God. So whatever the authority is, it's from who? So God is the supreme, sovereign God, even now within history. And he says that those which exist here on earth are established by God. Isn't that fascinating? You say, what about these crazy lunatic leaders? God has it there because God's unfolding history in the historical process in His way. Take it up with Him. But above all, God is in charge. Now go back to Habakkuk as he looks at this in verse 3. He's saying, in the midst of those years, make it known. God, you're in charge. What's happening in Israel? Right now, Israel, in this time period in Habakkuk, Israel's going to be overtaken by the Babylonians. Horrible government. What's Israel's government like? Well, there's no king in Israel. So they don't have a king. They're going to be overtaken by a really horrible group of people. And you're saying, what's going on, Lord? Why are you letting these things happen? Why are things out of your control? And He's saying, no, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not. And then it says, and notice what Habakkuk goes on to say. Here's a request he makes. He wants them to first of all, he wants to bring to life his designs for the future. At any moment now would be nice. Because if you think about it, 3 seconds from now is what? The future. That's good. Let's do it. Let's do it tomorrow. Let's do it right now, kind of thing. But he says, the last part of this is a request. In wrath, remember mercy. Wow. He knows God's going to unveil with His program is going to begin with a God that's going to carry out His wrath. It says in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, it says, through wrath, may you remember compassion. In other words, even though you're going to be angry and wrathful, which are justified reactions by God to what He's held off and He's long-suffering, He's extended grace to us. What Habakkuk's asking for is be compassionate to those that have to be compassionate. And God does agree with that. What does He say? I am compassionate to those I'm compassionate to, and I'm angry and wrathful for those I have to be. And God's what? He says, call me into account, check me out. And He says, am I wrong? Not that we can do that, not that we can take God to court, but we'll see in the end run, God knows best. It's interesting, in the midst of his circumstances, he asks for these 3 things. This is the initial request of his prayers. He asks for these 3 things. Which is interesting because it also assumes that Habakkuk and his readers, whoever might have gotten this as first readers, understood and knew God's reputation. Now, if you look at God's historical reputation, that is past events, God has carried out His wrath a few times. I think one of them was called what? The flood. God said it and waited 120 years and what? Did it. So in the midst of Noah's shipbuilding project, God was holding off His wrath, and Noah could have said, Lord, in the midst of this, make it known. And did God make it known? 120 years later, God made it known. So there are periods where God has unleashed, I guess, maybe that's not the best terminology, but His wrath has been shown in itty-bitty spots. You say, well, the worldwide flood wasn't itty-bitty. It was itty-bitty compared to what's coming. So you got to do the comparison. But it's interesting. There's a play on words here that I think is really interesting. That's dealing with this. He says, I've heard your proclamation. at the very beginning of this. I kind of skipped it. I wanted to go back for a second. He says, Lord, I have heard the report of thee. I have heard, which is interesting because it's a play on words. It's Shema Shema. Shema Shema. And it means I heard your proclamation. The report that you made, I heard it. And if you remember, Israel was always told the Shema. So they heard the report. It was always about interacting with what God had said and now doing what? Passing that information on to the next generation. So I've heard your report, and it awed him. It says I was in fear. How often do we hear something about God and it doesn't make us tremble? It doesn't even scare us. Because what? We're always talking about God is love. But God is also going to carry out His justice. And we better understand that there's a place for awe. How many times in the Bible have you seen somebody confronted with God and they fall flat on their face?
How many times does the Bible tell us be not afraid?
Yep. Well, there's and that's a difference. Afraid and fear are different things. Fear here is talking about awe and respect for who God is. I mean, there's a genuine awe and respect. Be not afraid because we don't have to be afraid. We have a relationship with God, but we better be much, and understand this, we better really be in awe of God. And respectful and reverent. I think all these are involved in that. So when it says fear, it's not the phobia side of it. But it's a respect side of it. Because what's He asking for? He's asking, God, I want your mercy. So God's got to be able to have that mercy in the midst of carrying out His wrath. He's got to know who He's dealing with constantly in that. You know? You think of a natural disaster and you say, well, did the natural disaster choose certain people? And so I remember, it really irritated me. There's a house near where Lizzie and I lived after Hurricane Andrew, and the lady my house survived. No, God blessed my house through Hurricane Andrew because I was, like the Lord loved me kind of thing. I'm wait a second, the Lord loves me just as much as He loves you. You want to go see my bomb shelter? Want to go see what my house looks like? I got skylights all over it, kind of thing. And what are you saying? God loved you more and was selective? No. See, that's not, God will, when the time comes, He will be like that. But when we talk natural disasters, God's not picking and choosing. It's just happening. And we can always say, even in the midst of a horrific incident and a loss of things, God still loves me. It's not relevant, And anyway, so let's look at the opening lines of the Overture, verses 3 through 15. He now visualizes what the Lord's going to unfold. And I think it's kind of neat here. I kind of put this pictures in poetry, but I'm not the world's greatest poet, so you're not going to ever get Eric's poems kind of thing. It's not going to happen. My poems go as far as roses are red, violets are blue. You stink and I do too, kind of thing. I'm not a poet guy, so if it didn't have laces, I didn't play it, so kind of thing. So, but if you look at this though, what Habakkuk understood more than anything is how God interacts with man. What happens today many times is people say God doesn't interact with man. God doesn't do it. God's not in history. God, there is a side of people that are really solid believers that say God has established everything, created everything. God just walked away. God walked away. He's just letting things go as they are, and God's not involved with any of us. God doesn't care what happens. God's just hands off. And I say, I got immense problems with that. That there's so many problems, but those are people that claim to be Bible-believing Christians. There's some that believe in theistic evolution. God started the evolutionary process. God walked away, and chaos took over. Really? Some of the things that people come up with are crazy. But it says, verse 3: God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. So we start with this opening phrase of what we're going to see in God's glory. It's interesting as I kind of was reflecting back and forth on as I was getting ready to teach this, and I was looking at the Hebrew commentary that the School of Judaism uses, very solid stuff that they use, and I'm saying I want to see if they get the understanding behind it It's all about God. Here's what they wrote in one part of this. It's very interesting. He who put, now you got to listen because I'm going to ask you a question. It says, he who puts his trust in God must patiently await the final coming of justice and must draw renewed vigor from his unshakable faith. Do you have a problem with that statement? See, part of it sounds really good. I mean, it really does. Listen to the first part again. He who puts trust in God must patiently wait for the final coming of justice. Anything wrong with that? I think there's zero wrong with that because we should, knowing God's going to carry out final justice, we're going to have to wait, maybe not come in our lifetime, you know. The next part, it says, must draw renewed vigor from his unshakable faith. See, what they do is they do the same hoop to hoop a lot of people do in Christianity today. How strong is your faith? Well, if you don't believe this, your faith must not be strong enough. If you don't believe that, your faith... See, we're shaped the wrong way. It's about me having enough that God will be pleased with. Problem is, we need to have enough of God so we're pleased and understand who He is. My faith is not shakable because I know who God is. If I look at who I am, I'm shakable. What your faith based on is who God is. They're saying that their faith is shakable, not because it's based on an object, only because it's theirs. I have a problem with that. Where's the object? See, if you don't have the object of faith, you're going to be very shakable.
Doesn't that, to me, when I think about what you just said,
Go ahead.
I think of where it says, I believe, Lord, help me in my unbelief.
Right.
Our faith isn't as strong as it could be.
Well, what God's going to do is give us more information. What did He do with Habakkuk? Habakkuk had problem. Habakkuk, which is interesting because it falls right in the midst of this book that they're giving this commentary and going, what? Listen, here's what Habakkuk was taught. God's word is as good as God is. So when God gives His word, it's solid. When God gives His promises, which is part of His word, He's solid because God has made those promises. Habakkuk had to understand, it's not about your circumstances, about what God has said and those promises He has made. Do you believe those? Can you trust God? And I think we said this a couple of times during this class. Can you trust God? And at the end of the night, Habakkuk says, Lord, I can trust you. But it doesn't say anything about his faith, because what was said about his faith? God already addressed that and says, if you're just, you will live by what? Faith. What's his faith oriented in? In God. You get the difference? He's planted. He understands who his God is. And this whole end of this poetic, musical ode, it's all about God. He's not shakable faith. He's got a sturdy, upright, strong, powerful God. And I think that's what we need. The more we have that, we don't look at our faith, we look upward. We look at Him. For instance, we could say the same thing. I am saved by grace because of what Christ did on my behalf, taking my sin upon the cross. I'm not shakable. Nobody can say to me, you lost that. Really? I can't. Where do we take that the rest of the way? Do we live life by faith, or do we live life by what we see, what's around us, what our circumstances? See, that's how Habakkuk was living for a while. He was saved. He understood what God had done to redeem His people. But he's looking at things and saying, Lord, I don't get this. What he needed was a good dose of who God is. And I think sometimes in the midst of our such circumstances and situations, we got to look at that. Now let me give you a breakdown of this before we go further in this chapter. And I got to take my musical interlude for 2 seconds because I got to explain something to you. First of all, we are dealing with 3 sections here. We've already looked at His prayer. We're also going to look at what God reveals in Israel's time of redemption in verses 3 through 13. That's why I said we're breaking off with the Selahs. And in verses 14 through 19, we're going to look at the tribulation in end times before the Messiah's reign. So we're going to get a picture of the tribulation to the end times. That means it'll start from the tribulation all the way probably through the millennium. Again, not nailing it down. But I want to talk to you about Hebrew poetry real quick. Since this is Hebrew poetry is the hardest to deal with to get a good interpretation. It's just hard because a lot of it requires... I remember being in 10th grade, I think it was, and we studied Shakespeare. And the teacher would say, what does this say to you? It doesn't say anything to me. It's like, well, what are these people saying? It's Shakespeare. I didn't speak in that kind of stuff. Just be clear. Say, I hate you, you hate me, get the knife out, Mark, and get it over with. Kind of thing. I was like, what is this stuff? And then she'd say, give your understanding of this line. You know, you'd have to go 6 line, 1, 2, what does that line mean? It means nothing to me. And that didn't pass the test ever. But poetry's hard, right? We can all get that when we get some really good, and, you read some poetry and what is it? Well, this poet must have been on LSD. I don't know what she was taking, kind of thing. They're writing things down. You go, what do they mean? But, stop that. But there's some poetry out there that's really cut and dry that's pretty funny. I used to read Ogden Nash every once in a while. Anybody heard of Ogden Nash? All his poetry is, I was sit in the hygienist chair without a single care. So I can understand that kind of poetry. When we get this, it's like, but see, what happens is not only we have poetry, but it's prophetic in nature. You see what we're dealing with? We're dealing with something that's not very clear all the time, especially if we're just dealing with Habakkuk and we're not going to take 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, not going to take Revelation, not going to take Ezekiel. We're just going to take it as a package here. And I already told you, not only does it have prophecy, it's poetry, it's got past tense. So we got those 3 issues going on, so it's kind of difficult. In closing moments as we deal with this, let me just give you a picture of this, and we'll pick up in Habakkuk 3:3 next week. Go to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53.
53.
Yeah, that's like one of the most well-known passages of Scripture. Yeah, we should know that. But this is very interesting. It's almost the same as Habakkuk. Why don't we know it as well as Habakkuk? I mean, it's not the same. It's not saying the same things. But it's the same structure, it's poetry, it's prophetic, and it's all past tense. You get what I'm saying?
Okay, how do you know it's poetry?
Because of the way it's laid out in the Hebrew. I'm taking that not only for me looking at it, but it's every commentator will tell you it's poetry. We look at poetry, and I do, because I'm really just not really good. Some know how to do different kinds of poetry. I look for something to rhyme. Okay, that's not how Hebrew works. There's some poetry which is a parallelism. In other words, one part of a verse will say something, the next part either says the same thing differently or says the same thing and expounds on it. Then the next part will say the same thing and expound on it even more, but a little differently. So there's different kinds of poetry. But if you notice, this is who has believed our message, or our report, or the gospel. Some people refer to it. I don't think it's necessarily the gospel, but it's good news, though. To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Does that sound past tense to you or future? See, if you read it, just read it straight up right. It's past tense. Okay, but it hasn't happened yet, because it says, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot. But it is, if you notice, it is past tense. Right? Or am I missing something? Okay? It says, but we all know this is talking about who? This is about the Messiah coming. It all refers to him because it says, like a root out of the parched ground, he has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised. Wait a second, he wasn't even here yet. Okay, if we were writing this, he says he will be despised, but it says he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hid their face. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Wait a second, we didn't even meet him. This is generations before Jesus, right? You understand so you kind of get a feel for it, but we're very familiar with this. We automatically said this is talking about Jesus, who's coming years from the time of Isaiah.
But that wasn't the original plan, was it?
Well, in God's mind, we're dealing with God dealing with the historical process. Yeah, I guess it was in God's plan. That would be years from here. Yes, you get what I'm saying? Remember when Mary got impregnated by the Holy Spirit coming upon her. that was at the right exact moment of time. God knew it would happen. It was a perfect person. It was the only person that would ever have the incarnate, the first, second person of the Trinity. That was Mary. Never happened again. It was the only time. So God knew that this would happen this many years from the time of Isaiah. Notice what it says in verse 4, though. Really cool. It says, surely our griefs, he himself, what? Bore. Not will bear, but he bore them. So how does God look at things? It's a done deal. How much from this will he be crucified? Many years. Okay? Our sorrows he carried. The transfer of our grief, he already did it. Wait a second. No, he hadn't. Not at that point. Okay? Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. And he was pierced through. He was pierced through for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquity. So you get the feel of what's going on. That's all I want you to do is see this. We're very familiar. Wow. We're very familiar with Isaiah 53 and the structure of it. We don't ever look at it and say, wow, that's past tense. I'm conflicted with it. You don't do that, right? So we shouldn't allow what we deal with Habakkuk conflict us. It's dealing with that future perfect kind of idea that will be done in the future aspect. Okay, we'll pick up here next week, and we will shift gears. It's going to be like next year. January, whatever the first, let's see, January would be January like 5th or 6th. No, I'll do the whole thing over.